The sun glinted off the polished brass letters spelling Oak Ridge Estates mounted on the imposing brick pillars that flanked the community's entrance. Behind those pillars stood the crown jewel of HOA President Martha Wilson's 5-year reign, 12-foot wrought iron gates with intricate scrollwork that simultaneously conveyed both luxury and impenetrability. Another layer of protection between us and the increasing crime rates in Westlake County, Martha would proclaim during HOA meetings, her voice carrying the assurance of someone who had successfully increased property values by 22% during her tenure. The new gate system had been installed just 6 weeks prior, requiring residents to replace their old key cards with proprietary fobs that cost $187 each. Visitors now had to be pre-registered through a dedicated app, with unscheduled guests requiring real-time approval via video call verification. Emergency services had supposedly been provided with override codes, though these had never been tested in a real-world scenario. At the contentious meeting where the $342,000 security upgrade was approved by a narrow 4-3 board vote, 72-year-old Elizabeth Chen had raised her hand. "What happens if someone inside needs urgent medical help?" she asked, her voice quavering slightly. "What if seconds count?" Martha had smiled with the practiced patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "The system includes emergency protocols, Elizabeth. Safety is precisely why we're implementing this. To protect all of us." Board member Richard Oakes had nodded along enthusiastically, adding, "The ambulance crews have universal access codes. It's standard procedure." What wasn't mentioned was that Martha's brother-in-law owned 30% of Safeguard Systems. The company awarded the installation contract without competitive bidding, a detail buried in meeting minutes few residents ever bothered to read. As residents adjusted to the new system, complaints mounted about pizza deliveries turned away, home health nurses stranded at the gate, and family members forced to wait sometimes upwards of 15 minutes for approval. Martha dismissed these as minor adjustment issues in her monthly newsletter column titled Security Matters. No one realized that the stage was being set for a tragedy that would tear the community apart and forever change how Oak Ridge Estates and HOAs across the state approached the balance between security and safety. Frank Ramirez stepped back from his prize rose bushes, wiping sweat from his brow despite the mild April temperature. The tightness in his chest had been coming and going all morning, but this time it lingered, spreading across his sternum like a vice slowly tightening. At 68, Frank had been a fixture in Oak Ridge Estates for 12 years. After retiring from 30 years of teaching high school history, he had poured his passion into cultivating what many consider the most beautiful garden in the community. His garden open days had become unofficial neighborhood events, with children particularly delighted by the butterfly sanctuary he'd created in his backyard. What neighbors didn't know was that Frank had been to 3 cardiology appointments in the past month. His doctor had adjusted his medications twice, and the words potential bypass surgery had been mentioned during his last visit. Frank hadn't told anyone, not his neighbors, not even his daughter Carmen, who lived 2 hours away. He didn't want to worry her, especially with her law firm partnership coming up for review. As Frank stumbled into his kitchen, the pain radiated down his left arm. The bottle of water he'd been holding crashed to the floor, water spreading across the terracotta tiles he and his late wife had installed together 15 years ago. He fumbled for his phone, the screen blurring as he tried to focus. When the 911 dispatcher answered, Frank managed to gasp out his address, 4287 Magnolia Lane, Oak Ridge Estates. His voice was barely audible when he added, "Heart. I think heart attack." The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. "Mr. Ramirez, we're sending help immediately. Stay on the line if you can. Are you alone in the house?" Frank made a sound of affirmation as he slid down against his refrigerator, family photos held by magnets showing happier times. Carmen's law school graduation, his 40th anniversary with Elena before cancer took her, a fishing trip with his grandson last summer. Ambulance is on the way, estimated arrival time 7 minutes, the dispatcher said, not knowing the community's new gate system was about to turn those 7 minutes into an eternity. As Frank's phone slipped from his weakening grasp, the last thing he saw was a text notification from his daughter. "Dad, great news. Made partner. Calling you tonight to celebrate. Love you." Paramedics James Chen and Layla Thompson were 4 minutes into their response time when dispatch radioed that their destination was within Oak Ridge Estates, a gated community. "We have the emergency override code in the system," the dispatcher assured them. "Code is Delta 9 to 73 Echo." James nodded to Layla, who made note of it. They'd dealt with gated communities before. It was standard procedure in Westlake County, where nearly 40% of residences were behind some form of controlled access. The ambulance approached the ornate entrance to Oak Ridge Estates at 3:49 p.m., lights flashing and siren wailing. James pulled up to the access panel and entered the code. The small screen blinked red. "Access denied." "That's odd," James muttered, trying the code again. Same result. Layla was already on the radio. "Dispatch, override code is not working at Oak Ridge Estates gate." While waiting for a response, James pressed the call button for the security booth visible about 20 feet inside the gate. After 3 rings, a young man's voice answered, "Oak Ridge Estates Security, this is Robert Mills. This is Westlake County Emergency Services. We have a possible cardiac event at 4287 Magnolia Lane. We need immediate access," James stated firmly, the practiced urgency in his voice unmistakable. There was a pause before Robert responded. "I'll need to verify that. What's the resident's name?" Layla checked her tablet. "Frank Ramirez. Male, 68 years old. Reported chest pains consistent with heart attack." "Sir, we need access now." "I'm sorry, but I need to follow protocol. I have to call the resident to confirm." "He's potentially incapacitated," James interrupted, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. "That's why we're here. This is an emergency." "I understand, but I just started this job 2 weeks ago, and I was explicitly told never to open the gate without verification. Let me call the resident." The digital clock on the ambulance dashboard showed 3:52 p.m. James and Layla exchanged glances. 3 crucial minutes had already passed. "He's not answering." Robert's voice returned. "I'll need to contact an HOA board member for authorization." "This is a life-threatening emergency," Layla nearly shouted. "Every minute decreases survival chances by 7 to 10%. "I'm sorry, but I don't have authorization to override the system. I'm calling the HOA president now." By 3:56 p.m., James was considering whether ramming the gate would be justified, calculating if the ambulance could break through without disabling the vehicle. Layla had contacted their supervisor, who was now also trying to reach Oak Ridge Estates management. At 3:58 p.m., Robert returned to the call. "Ms. Wilson isn't answering. I'm trying other board members." At 4:01 p.m., Layla, normally composed even in crisis situations, slammed her fist against the dashboard. "This is criminally negligent. Get us in there now." At 4:04 p.m., the supervisor radioed that they were dispatching a police unit to assist, estimated arrival in 6 minutes. At 4:07 p.m., 18 minutes after their arrival at the gate, Martha Wilson's voice finally came through the intercom. "This is Martha Wilson, HOA president. What's the emergency?" James, his voice tight with controlled fury, explained the situation for what felt like the 20th time. "Oh my goodness, open the gate immediately, Robert," Martha commanded. As the gates finally began to swing open, James didn't wait for them to part completely before accelerating through the narrowing gap, side view mirror scraping against ironwork with a screech that perfectly expressed the paramedics' frustration. The dashboard clock read 4:08 p.m. as they sped down Magnolia Lane, knowing that in cardiac events, the golden hour was rapidly tarnishing into leaden irreversibility. Frank Ramirez's front door was unlocked, a small mercy in a situation that had offered none so far. Layla shouldered it open, while James followed with the emergency response kit and defibrillator. They found Frank collapsed on the kitchen floor, his skin ashen and lips tinged blue. No pulse. No respiration. The phone lay inches from his outstretched hand, the screen still displaying his daughter's celebratory text message. Training took over as they initiated CPR, Layla performing compressions while James attached the AED pads to Frank's chest. The automated voice of the defibrillator provided the only commentary, analyzing rhythm, shock advised, stand clear. They worked with the choreographed precision of experienced emergency responders, intubation, epinephrine, continued compressions, but both recognized the grim reality. The 18-minute delay had drastically reduced Frank's chances of survival. Outside, neighbors had begun to gather on their manicured lawns, drawn by the flashing lights. Eleanor Martinez, Frank's next-door neighbor who had been watering her garden when the ambulance screamed past, stood closest to the house, still holding her watering can as if frozen in place. Inside, the battle continued for 24 more minutes, James and Layla refusing to yield to statistics that already predicted the outcome. At 4:32 p.m., Layla looked at James across Frank's still form and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. James checked his watch and spoke the words neither wanted to say. Time of death, 4:32 p.m. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of their radio and the distant sound of the police cruiser that had finally arrived, too late to make any difference. As protocol demanded, James began completing the incident report while Layla prepared to speak with the gathering neighbors. The report form included a section labeled Factors Affecting Response Time. James wrote in precise, clinical detail about the gate access delay, including exact times and names. Robert Mills, security guard. Martha Wilson, HOA president. The report mentioned the failed override code, the refusal to grant emergency access, and the 18-minute delay. What the report couldn't capture was the image seared into both paramedics' minds. Frank's phone showing his daughter's message of celebration, never to be answered. As Layla stepped outside to face the neighbors, the police officer approached, asking what had happened. Her explanation was interrupted by a sharp cry from Eleanor Martinez. "It was those damn gates, wasn't it? I told them at the meeting. I told Martha this would happen someday." The officer looked questioningly at Layla, who nodded almost imperceptibly. There was a significant delay in gaining access to the community, she confirmed professionally, though the tension in her voice was unmistakable. As if summoned by the controversy, Martha Wilson's silver Mercedes pulled up to the scene. She emerged, her typically immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, eyes wide with concern that seemed genuine, if belated. "Is everything all right? I came as soon as I could," Martha began, then faltered as she registered the somber expressions and Eleanor's tearful glare. "Mr. Ramirez has passed away," Layla stated flatly. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that there will be an official investigation into the access delay. The County Emergency Services Director will be contacting you." As Martha's hand flew to her mouth in shock, Eleanor stepped forward, her voice rising with each word. "You and your precious Gates killed Frank. He would have had a chance if help could have reached him." The officer moved between the women as neighbors murmured and smartphones emerged to record the confrontation. The tragedy was quickly becoming a spectacle, the first act in what would soon evolve into a community-splitting drama. Inside, James added one final note to his report before signing it. "In my professional opinion, the delay in reaching the patient significantly reduced chances of successful resuscitation." He didn't normally add such comments, but something about Frank's unanswered text message and the preventable waste of precious minutes compelled him to create a record that couldn't be ignored or minimized. No one present could have predicted how quickly this documentation would become the foundation for multiple lawsuits, or how completely one man's death would unravel the social fabric of Oak Ridge Estates. But as the coroner's van pulled up to remove Frank's body, the first threads were already beginning to fray. The emergency HOA meeting scheduled for 7:00 p.m. Friday, just 3 days after Frank's death, had to be moved from the community clubhouse to the local high school auditorium to accommodate the unprecedented turnout. Nearly every one of Oak Ridge Estate's 187 households was represented, with some residents bringing attorneys or family members as witnesses. Martha Wilson sat at a folding table on the stage, flanked by the remaining board members. 2 empty chairs signified the hasty resignations of board members Richard Oakes and Samantha Perkins, who had both cited personal reasons in identically worded emails sent the previous evening. The meeting began with Martha's attempt at a unifying statement. "We are gathered tonight to mourn the tragic loss of our neighbor, Frank Ramirez, and to address concerns about our emergency response protocols." She never finished the sentence. Eleanor Martinez stood up from her front row seat, brandishing a stack of papers. "This isn't about concerns, Martha. This is about criminal negligence." Eleanor's voice projected clearly through the auditorium. "I've obtained a copy of the paramedics' report through my son who works at the hospital. 18 minutes. They were kept waiting for 18 minutes while Frank died." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Eleanor continued. "And I've also brought copies of the meeting minutes from January, where the board was explicitly warned about emergency access issues by the fire marshal during the security system presentation. A warning that was dismissed and doesn't even appear in the official minutes distributed to residents." Martha's face pale as whispers became outright conversations throughout the room. Board member Thomas Wells leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear, but she waved him off. "Order, please," Martha called out, tapping her gavel. "We understand emotions are running high, but—" "My emotions aren't running high, Martha. My friend is dead," interrupted Sophia Patel, a retired doctor who lived across from Frank. "And as a physician, I can tell you with absolute certainty that in cardiac events, 18 minutes can be the difference between life and death." The meeting devolved from there, with residents forming clear factions. On one side stood those calling for the entire board's resignation and a complete overhaul of community security measures. On the other, a smaller but vocal group defended the need for strict security protocols, suggesting the tragedy was an unfortunate but rare exception that could be addressed with procedural adjustments. "My home was broken into twice before I moved here," called out Gerald Thompson from the back. "I specifically chose Oak Ridge because of the security. It's tragic what happened to Frank, but we can't just throw open our gates." This was met with jeers from many and applause from some. The division was palpable, cutting through friendships and even families. The Dorset couple openly argued with each other from the same row of seats. Local news cameras captured it all from the back of the auditorium, having been tipped off by an anonymous resident. The headline "Gayes Keep Out Ambulance Resident Diaz" was already running on the evening news ticker. By the meeting's end at 11:23 p.m., only 2 concrete actions had been taken: an unanimous vote to immediately implement new emergency services access protocols, and the establishment of a memorial fund for Frank Ramirez. Everything else, including calls for resignations, third-party investigations, and dissolution of contracts with safeguard systems, was tabled for a future meeting pending legal review. As residents dispersed into the parking lot, neighbors who had previously shared holiday cookies and watched each other's homes during vacations now avoided eye contact or openly glared at those perceived to be on the wrong side of the issue. What no one in the auditorium knew was that 112 miles away, Carmen Ramirez Peterson sat in her law firm's conference room at midnight with 3 colleagues, reviewing security camera footage from the Oak Ridge Estates gate that her firm had already subpoenaed. Her eyes were red but focused, her newly engraved partner nameplate sitting untouched beside a stack of preliminary legal filings. "We'll file first thing Monday morning," her senior partner had advised. "With the paramedics' report and this footage, it's one of the clearest cases of negligence I've seen in 20 years of practice." Carmen nodded, watching the timestamp on the video as it showed the ambulance waiting minute after excruciating minute. "This isn't just about Dad anymore," she said quietly. "This is about making sure it never happens to anyone else." The Westlake County Courthouse had never seen anything quite like it. By 9:08 a.m. Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Frank Ramirez's death, no fewer than 4 separate lawsuits had been electronically filed related to the incident. By close of business, the count had risen to 7. Carmen Ramirez Peterson's wrongful death lawsuit was the most comprehensive, naming as defendants the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association as an entity, Martha Wilson, Thomas Wells, and the other board members individually, Safeguard Systems, Incorporated, Robert Mills personally, and 5 John Doe corporate entities representing various contractors and subcontractors involved in the gate system's installation. The 47-page complaint detailed not just the circumstances of Frank's death, but also uncovered a pattern of concerning decisions by the HOA board. The no-bid contract awarded to Safeguard Systems, with no disclosure of Martha Wilson's family connection. Email exchanges showing the board had been warned 3 times by the County Emergency Services Department about potential access issues. Documentation that the override codes provided to emergency services had never been tested during system implementation. Evidence that resident complaints about gate malfunctions had been systematically minimized in official records. The lawsuit demanded $18.7 million in compensatory damages and unspecified punitive damages, plus a court order requiring Oak Ridge Estates to completely overhaul its security systems under county supervision. Local attorney Jeffrey Barnes, who specialized in HOA law, described it as a legal neutron bomb in an interview with the Westlake Tribune. This isn't just about one tragedy. It's about exposing the often unchecked power of HOAs and the potential consequences when security becomes a fetish rather than a rational policy. But Carmen's lawsuit was just the beginning. By Wednesday, the County Emergency Services Department had filed regulatory complaints against the HOA for violating 3 different county ordinances regarding emergency vehicle access. These violations carry potential fines of up to $50,000 per day until rectified. Robert Mills, the security guard who had been fired by Safeguard Systems the day after the incident, filed a wrongful termination suit claiming he had simply followed the explicit protocols he had been trained to implement. His lawsuit included text messages from his supervisor instructing guards to never, under any circumstances, open the gate without verification, even for people in uniforms. The Oak Ridge Estates insurance carrier, Meridian Indemnity, filed a declaratory judgment action asserting that the HOA's policy excluded coverage for willful or knowing violations of law or regulation, potentially leaving board members personally exposed for millions in liability. Martha Wilson's initial response was to call an emergency board meeting to authorize the HOA's legal defense, but when she arrived at the community clubhouse, she found the doors locked and a note taped to the entrance. Meeting canceled by majority board vote. All communications to be handled through legal counsel only. She later learned that 4 of the 6 remaining board members had met privately with attorneys who advised them to distance themselves from her leadership and decision-making. By Friday, Martha was receiving calls from residents who had spotted moving trucks outside her home, fueling rumors that she was fleeing the mounting legal pressure. The reality was more mundane, but equally telling. Martha had simply moved valuable artwork and family heirlooms to storage after receiving anonymous threatening notes in her mailbox. As legal documents proliferated, media interest intensified. National morning shows featured segments on HOA horror stories, with Frank's death as the centerpiece. Security camera footage of the ambulance waiting at the gate, leaked from an unknown source, went viral online, garnering millions of views and thousands of outraged comments. State legislators, sensing political opportunity, announced plans to introduce a Frank Ramirez Act that would standardize emergency access requirements for all private communities and impose criminal penalties for interference with emergency responders. In her downtown law office, Carmen Ramirez Peterson ignored the media requests piling up in her inbox. Instead, she focused on a photograph of her father she placed on her desk, Frank standing proudly in his garden, pruning shears in hand, smiling in the sunshine. Next to it sat a just-delivered expert witness report from one of the nation's leading cardiologists, confirming what she already knew in her heart. With prompt medical attention, her father would have had approximately a 67% chance of survival. "This isn't the partnership celebration I imagined, Dad," she whispered to the photograph. "But I promise you, something good will come from this." Martha Wilson sat alone in her attorney's office, staring at the stack of legal documents that now represented her life's new reality. In just 7 weeks, she had been served with 11 separate lawsuits, received 2 grand jury subpoenas, and been named in countless news articles portraying her as the villain in what national media now called the deadly gates of Oak Ridge. They're offering a settlement option, her attorney explained, sliding a document across the polished conference table. Meridian Indemnity will cover $2.4 million of the proposed settlement to Carmen Ramirez Peterson, but you and the other board members would each need to contribute $75,000 personally. Martha's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the document. "That's nearly all I have in savings," she whispered. "It's either that or risk going to trial where a jury could award much more, well beyond what insurance would cover," her attorney replied matter-of-factly. "The discovery process hasn't been kind to your position, Martha." That was an understatement. Depositions had revealed that Martha had personally removed the fire marshal's warnings from official meeting minutes. Email records showed she had dismissed resident complaints about gate malfunctions as hysterical overreactions. Most damaging was the revelation that Safeguard Systems had paid for Martha and 2 other board members to attend a security conference in Maui that was little more than a 3-day resort vacation. Meanwhile, the remaining board members were engaged in a desperate attempt to save themselves. Thomas Wells had turned over thousands of emails and text messages to Carmen's attorneys in exchange for being dropped from her lawsuit. Board member Jennifer Sandoval had given a tear-filled interview to the local news, claiming she had been manipulated and misled by Martha about security system requirements. The HOA itself was in financial freefall, with legal bills mounting and many residents withholding their dues in protest. Basic services like landscaping and pool maintenance had been suspended. Property values in Oak Ridge Estates had plummeted by 31% in just 2 months, with several homes sitting vacant after owners simply walked away from underwater mortgages. Safeguard Systems faced its own implosion. Following the Oak Ridge incident, 3 other communities had canceled their contracts, and a routine audit had uncovered that the company had been installing substandard equipment while charging premium prices. The revelation that Martha's brother-in-law owned a significant stake in the company had triggered a state investigation into corrupt procurement practices. Robert Mills, the former security guard, had given emotional testimony in his wrongful termination case, describing how he had been thrown under the bus for following explicit protocols. His attorney had uncovered safeguard training materials that specifically instructed guards to never yield to pressure from anyone claiming emergency status without proper verification. The web of litigation expanded in unexpected directions daily. Homeowners had filed a class action suit against both the HOA and individual board members for breach of fiduciary duty, citing the plummeting property values. The county had imposed emergency changes to the gate system, installing their own override box that gave emergency services direct control, and billing the HOA $178,000 for the mandatory emergency correction. Even the security system manufacturer had been pulled into the fray, with evidence emerging that they had known their override code system was incompatible with the county's emergency services database, but had concealed this fact to secure the lucrative contract. Martha signed the settlement agreement with a resigned sigh. Her reputation was in tatters, her savings nearly depleted, and her standing in the community irreparably damaged. Just 3 months ago, she had been featured in Luxury Living magazine as a visionary community leader who had transformed Oak Ridge Estates into the model of modern secure living. Now, as she left her attorney's office, a news van idling outside caught sight of her. A reporter rushed over, microphone extended. "Mrs. Wilson, do you have any response to the criminal negligence charges the district attorney is considering?" Martha hurried to her car without answering, the weight of how completely her life had collapsed pressing down on her shoulders. The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had been so obsessed with keeping perceived threats out of Oak Ridge Estates had herself become the thing residents most feared. 18 months after Frank Ramirez's death, Oak Ridge Estates looked markedly different. The imposing wrought iron gates remained, but they now stood permanently open during daylight hours, with a separate emergency access lane controlled directly by county emergency services through a specialized radio frequency system. The community clubhouse, once reserved primarily for HOA meetings and Martha Wilson's wine and cheese socials, had been renamed the Frank Ramirez Community Center. Today it was filled with residents gathered for the dedication of the memorial garden created where a decorative fountain had once stood. Carmen Ramirez Peterson stood at a small podium, her father's garden shears mounted in a shadow box beside her. The $3.2 million settlement she had eventually received had been partially used to establish the Frank Ramirez Safety Foundation, which provided grants to communities seeking to upgrade emergency access systems and education for HOA boards about safety protocols. My father loved creating beautiful spaces where life could flourish, Carmen began, her voice steady. The tragedy of his death revealed how easily communities can prioritize appearance and exclusivity over actual safety and well-being. But what's happened here at Oak Ridge Estates since then gives me hope. She gestured to the new HOA board members seated in the front row, a diverse group that included Eleanor Martinez and Sophia Patol, who had led the community reform movement. The board now included 2 seats permanently reserved for county safety officials serving in an advisory capacity, a structure that had become a model for other HOAs across the state. The legal aftermath had indeed been transformative. Safeguard Systems had declared bankruptcy after similar cases emerged in other communities they serviced. Martha Wilson and 3 other former board members had ultimately faced misdemeanor charges for falsifying safety records, receiving probation and community service requirements. The state legislature had passed a modified version of the Frank Ramirez Act, requiring standardized emergency access systems for all gated communities, monthly testing protocols, and significant penalties for non-compliance. Governor Sanderson had invited Carmen to the signing ceremony, where the bill was celebrated as a rare bipartisan achievement. Perhaps most significantly, the nationwide attention to the case had sparked conversations about the largely unchecked power of homeowners associations. Legal scholars had published analyses of how HOAs often operated with minimal oversight despite wielding substantial authority over residents' lives. Several states had introduced legislation requiring greater transparency, term limits for board members, and easier pathways for residents to challenge HOA decisions. As Carmen concluded her remarks, she unveiled a simple bronze plaque mounted beside a thriving rosebush transplanted from her father's garden, in memory of Frank Ramirez, teacher, gardener, neighbor. His passing taught us that true security comes not from gates and walls, but from a community that values all lives and ensures help can always reach those in need. Eleanor Martinez, now serving as HOA president, stepped forward to make her own announcement. In addition to this memorial, I'm pleased to share that through the cooperation of residents and county officials, Oak Ridge Estates has been certified as a heart-safe community with AEE devices installed throughout the neighborhood and quarterly CPR training sessions held right here in the community center. As residents mingled following the ceremony, there was a palpable sense that something valuable had emerged from tragedy. Property values had not only recovered but increased as the community became known for its innovative approach to balancing security with safety. New families moving in often cited the community's response to crisis as their reason for choosing Oak Ridge Estates. Robert Mills, who had received a settlement in his wrongful termination case, had used the funds to pursue paramedic training and now worked for the County Emergency Services Department. He frequently gave presentations to security companies about the importance of prioritizing emergency access. Thomas Wells, one of the few original board members who had survived the legal fallout, approached Carmen as she stood admiring the garden. "Your father would have loved this," he said quietly. "The irises especially. I remember how proud he was of them." Carmen nodded. "He always said gardens aren't really about plants. They're about creating spaces where life thrives. I think that's what communities should be too." As dusk fell over Oak Ridge Estates, the automatic lights illuminated the memorial garden. Inside the community center, residents continued discussions about the upcoming expansion of their community alert system. Outside, an ambulance passed through the open gates on its way to a nearby neighborhood, unimpeded and unremarkable, exactly as it should be. The tragedy that had torn Oak Ridge Estates apart had ultimately rebuilt it into something stronger, more compassionate, and truly secure in ways that no gate or wall could ever provide. Frank Ramirez's death had forced a reckoning with the true meaning of community safety, a lesson written not just in legal reforms and procedural changes, but in the renewed connections between neighbors who had learned the hard way that looking out for each other was the most important rule of all.